As many of you know, our theme for this year is Dissent, inspired both by the massive Black Lives Matter protests of this summer and also by the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Taken together, they ask us to think about the urgency of dissent in its myriad forms for the advancing of social justice, for the raising of collective consciousness, and for the very project of democracy itself. What role, we plan to ask today, might humanities centers play as sites of dissent, both institutionally and in the community more broadly? What does public, collective, or shared dissent look like? The CHR Steering Committee and I have convened a distinguished panel of speakers, individuals whose work actively engage notions of dissent, but who also understand the importance of humanities centers in leading initiatives that support forms of dissent broadly conceived. Many of our panelists are also inaugural directors of humanities centers, initiatives, and programs, and as such have been the primary architects of their architects of their centers and initiatives, developing innovative programming, some of which they will share with us today. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce to you our esteemed panelists. Wendy Hesford is the Faculty Director of Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme, and also Ohio Eminent Scholar and Professor of English at Ohio State University. She has published 7 books, including the award-winning Spectacular Rhetorics, Human Rights Visions, Recognitions, and Feminisms, which analyzes how the rhetorical and visual frameworks that underlie human rights law construct certain bodies and populations as victims, and in so doing, delimit public responses to violence and injustice. Her book, Violent Exceptions, Children's Human Rights and Humanitarian Rhetoric, is forthcoming this spring. Sylvester Johnson is the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities. He's also professor of religion and culture and assistant vice provost for the humanities. Johnson specializes in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. He's the author of The Myth of Ham in 19th Century American Christianity and African American Religions 1500 to 2000, an interpretation of 5 centuries of democracy, colonialism, and freedom in the Atlantic world. Rather than treating freedom and its others, colonialism, slavery, and racism, as opposites, he interprets multiple periods of Black religious history to discern how Atlantic empires, particularly that of the United States, simultaneously enable the emergence of particular forms of religious experience and freedom movements, as well as disturbing patterns of violent domination. He's currently writing a book on human identity in the age of intelligent machines and human-machine symbiosis, and also producing a digital scholarly edition of an early English history of global religions. Susan Petry is professor and former chair in the Department of Dance at Ohio State University. She is a choreographer and performer with an international and award-winning career, and since 2019 has served as the Arts Faculty Fellow for the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery theme. Her awards, including 8 from Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Awards, are too numerous to count. And she has served on the board of National Association of Schools of Dance for 6 years, on the board for Strategic National Art Alumni Project, and currently with the Columbus Dance Alliance. Much of her work for these organizations is aimed at dismantling racist structures, language, and practices. Nicoletta Pireddu is the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative and professor of Italian and comparative literature at Georgetown University. Pireddu works on interdisciplinary approaches to literature and the history of ideas, especially European, Mediterranean, and transnational identities, borders, and migration. Among her most recent books are the works of Claudio Magris, Temporary Homes, Mobile Identities, European Borders. Her edited volume, Reframing Critical, Literary, and Cultural Theories, Thought on the Edge, addresses a broad variety of issues from questions of space, the human and political action, to post-secularism, methodological intersections between scientific and critical theory, post-colonialism and cosmopolitanism, and new philosophical categories for theoretical reflection and literary analysis, among others. Her most recent book, Migrating Minds, Theories and Practices of Cultural Cosmopolitanism, will be forthcoming in 2021. Finally, I would like to introduce my colleague, Denise Albanese, Professor of English and Cultural Studies, and members of the CHR Steering Committee who will moderate our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Very much looking forward to this conversation, which I hope will follow along the lines as we've already discussed talking first about the disciplinary level, then potentially talking at the institutional level, and then finally talking about sort of national conversations and public discourse about education, all of this around the idea of dissent. So I'd like to start us off by asking each of you to consider to what extent humanities research, and that of course that includes arts research and arts practice as well, might constitute a form of dissent, perhaps epistemological dissent, or perhaps dissent by means of practice in specific fields and even across disciplines. I'd like to invite you to speak to how your specific humanities agendas and centers participate in fostering what we might call dissident knowledges. And Sylvester, maybe would you mind starting us off?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So really excited to be on the panel. So thanks for the invitation, and it's great. I look forward to engaging with our audience as well. So at Virginia Tech, our Humanities Center is supporting humanistic, human-centered scholarship broadly. We have a big tent definition of what counts as humanities, that it is humanistic, human-centered. That's many different disciplines. And one of the things that we're doing is focusing on the inclusion of humanists in leadership of technology innovation. We mean that very broadly, thinking about democratic outcomes. Technology is not just technical systems, but a comprehensive set of challenges that requires a comprehensive set of inputs and levels of expertise that has to include human-centered approaches. And so one of the takeaways of that effort is to focus on the big challenge that we're facing as a global society, and that's inequality. It is one of the huge opportunity spaces and problem spaces for trying to understand both the promises and pitfalls of technology. And we quickly think of things such as AI ethics, algorithmic bias, that are all exemplifying the results of having a very narrow set of actors who create systems to deploy them. We need to be more inclusive in the talent that we involve and in the aims that we're trying to achieve. And so there's a social justice element to that. Another thing we're doing is hosting a summer institute funded by the Henry Luce Foundation that is focused on some of the ethical considerations that humanistic scholars need to consider. And we're trying to be very inclusive in whom we bring into that along vectors of race, of gender and sexuality, because those are some of the critical vectors that we need to use in order to inform some of the aims. We've also received very important support from the Mellon Foundation to incorporate some social justice approaches to teaching from a human-centered approach about technology in order to shape future talent.
Wendy or Susan, or both?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Thank you very much for doing this and for including our unique situation of having humanities and arts together in our so-called discovery theme. And we will probably sound like a broken record in that the side-by-sideness of humanities and arts has created very interesting and productive conversations. To answer the kind of question about dissent and discipline, I've been musing that in many of the arts, there is an implicit disassembling, there's an implicit taking apart in order to build. So the making of art, the making of works of art, whether performance or visual, requires creating space in order for something new to become, to grow. So that dissent is woven in the very fabric of making, right? We don't know what we're doing sometimes. That also makes a challenge of our position in institution of higher education. And that the productive and ethical, as Sylvester was talking about, the productive and ethical process of dissent has to then bring into that what's left is what we need to then build up. So if we're taking away by dissent, what are we building up?
And I think I would just add by speaking a little bit more broadly about our initiative and how it has been formed in large part in relationship to understanding certain iterations of dissent. Before I speak about that, though, I do want to just let all of our folks in the audience know that the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme is at Ohio State, a university-wide initiative that's located within the Office of Academic Affairs. And in that regard, it's distinct, institutionally distinct from the university's Humanities Institute, the Barnett Center for the Arts, Integrated Arts and Enterprise, and the Wexner Center for the Arts. We work in collaboration with these other entities, but we are not those entities in particular. We're more like the networking among them and between them. We help fund certain cross-disciplinary projects within those various institutes and others on campus. But as I was thinking about this question of dissent, I started to go back to one of the requirements I almost felt that I had to unpack when I was appointed as faculty director to the discovery theme. And that was the construct of discovery. And I thought, oh, wait a second, we're in Columbus, right? The town that is named after European colonist, right? Who basically wielded all kinds of violence, et cetera, against the indigenous and lands, et cetera. And here we are in Columbus calling ourselves, naming ourselves a discovery theme after a city that is also kind of owned that language for better or worse over the years, and itself has defined its use of discovery. So I felt like, okay, the first thing we need to do is unpack what does that mean with regard to our entire initiative. So I started to think about itself as a critical framework, as a dissenting framework for the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery theme. And to go back to your precise question, Denise, I do think that the arts and humanities that it is a form of and can be a form of epistemological dissent, though not only that, right? And I'm thinking that the word discovery itself, right, reveals to us the unknown, right? The idea of to bring forth new knowledge. But it does not only refer to what is newly seen, right? But it refers to the act or the process of discovering as well. And so when we start to think about the act or the process of unveiling discoveries, we start to think about for whom such knowledge has been constructed or rendered invisible to begin with, or made visible, and from whom it has been concealed. So from the get-go, I was trying to think of a frame for our initiative that would take into account questions like, what narratives or histories make discoveries recognizable or pertinent to some but not others? Who benefits from the revelation of a particular discovery? So I think, and we can talk more about this later in response to perhaps some of the other questions, but I do think that dissent is a core goal of what we seek to do in terms of thinking about the process of naming, mapping, remembering, the investment of value or its withholding onto certain people's cultures, objects, archives, research. So I guess I hadn't thought about it this, in terms of dissent until you asked the question and framed this panel. But I do think that approaching the arts and humanities critically through the construct of discovery and or dissent helps us reconcile these past and present and future investments that the arts and humanities open up for us.
I've muted myself so you couldn't hear me say, Nicoletta, please, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, thank you. I thought of dissent in connection with the mission of the Humanities Initiative at Georgetown, itself inspired by the notion of cura personalis, so the care for the whole person, and the emphasis, the centrality of human values and principles. Values and principles that are crucial to the mission of the humanities itself. crucially now, in light of what we're living in the US, a conjuncture that has deeply, I would say, destabilized the notion and the function of truth in fundamental domains of our lives, political, medical, legal, social, ethical. And I thought of this, precisely the alarming divisions that we are experiencing shows us that we are immersed in a scenario of, I would say, apparently non-negotiable dissent, a bipolar one. This seems the new status quo. And so in my view, the challenge and the opportunity for the humanities are hence to use dissent constructively, to foster perspectives or encounters, collaborative projects that allow us to recognize the productive value of disagreements and of differences, and that challenge us to think otherwise, to imagine something else, so as to bring us back together as human beings. In other words, to dissent from the current clash of extremes, not only by sorting what is reliable knowledge and what is opinion, misinformation, or fanatic ideologies, but also by finding common grounds to rebuild communities, communities of learners, of thinkers, of citizens, of trust, fostering dialogue and ways of understanding each other by sharing our stories, which is really the gist, the scope of the humanities. And again, this is part of Georgetown educational mission. And this takes me to another point. Now, it's as though the humanities were trying to dissent from a sort of a prioristic dissent that is really affecting our life in society right now. And so in order to dissent productively, in order to recognize, I would say, the value of disagreement and differences, we need to know that from which we dissent. And this is important, in my view, for the student dimension, which is crucial at Georgetown. We're trying to involve students as much as possible in what we are doing. So in my view, we can distinguish truth from post-truth or alternative facts if we ground our claims and reactions upon solid cultural bases. So the humanities are crucial also as a repository of knowledge, I would say, even the traditional one. Students need to own conventional wisdom in order to be able to critique it. History has to be studied rather than erased because we need to learn from it and also avoid repeating it if necessary. Essentially, if we want to understand how values are formed and how to make choices moving forward, we cannot ignore the choices of the past and of the present. And so this takes me to another point, which again is part of the mission of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. So tradition and innovation, what is the relationship between the two? Is it a tension or is it a synergy? And you know, one of the animating principles in this discussion is to reflect upon forms of epistemological dissent that emerge from the humanities. But this also pertains to the identity and the role of the humanities themselves, meaning that there are different ways of conceiving the scholarly or pedagogical or public-facing mission of humanities disciplines and centers, even within one institution. And I bring in my still relatively short experience in my capacity as inaugural director. I hear a plurality of voices on campus. On the one hand, dissent is, for some colleagues, expected to, I would say, enfranchise the humanities from the legacy of a certain Eurocentric humanism and focus rather on what cannot be reconciled under the umbrella of this alleged common humanity. In other words, it is necessary to decenter the idea and the scope of the humanities center. But on the other hand, I also perceive an interest in more traditional forms and objects of humanistic inquiry. And I think it is essential to find ways of supporting them as well. So as we try to find, I would say, forward-looking ways to explain humanities work or communicate the values of this work to the world at large, we need to explore the intersection and the balance between, I would say, the historical value of the humanities and its current practices. And these are different expectations on what the humanities are and mean, and what humanities centers are supposed to do, that emerge also in my interaction with different stakeholders. And I give you an example and then I close. With parents and with donors, it becomes even more crucial to emphasize the constructive aspect of the humanities, their formative role for students, at least from a rhetorical point of view, rather than the, I would say, overtly dissident knowledge that they foster. And I'm keeping it in mind, it's a lesson I'm learning, I'm keeping it in mind, meaning that one size does not fit all the time. One language with which we refer to what we're trying to do doesn't always work so successfully, even in one specific institution. So for the moment, I stop here, and I am ready to discuss further in the question and answer period.
I'd like, if I may, pick
Go ahead.
up on
Please.
something that Nicoletta just said. Would that be all right, Denise?
Absolutely.
Okay. I really liked the way you, and actually Susan as well, framed dissent as productive, right? Because I think that's one of the keys to thinking about humanities centers or initiatives in this way. And one of the ways I believe that we're going toward the productive, or thinking about dissent also as production, not just being productive, is magnifying and demonstrating interdependencies, cultural, political interdependencies. And the way in which, one of the ways in which we're doing that is by showcasing cross-disciplinary work, not just between arts and humanities or among the humanities, but across all the disciplines as much as we can. So one of our signature features is cross-disciplinarity. But as you're also saying, there's this very challenging, it's not exactly a balance, but responsibility to not misplace or displace or marginalize disciplinary expertise, even though you're focusing and investing in cross-disciplinary collaborations. So what we have had to do to try to address any misconceptions perhaps about our goals, or to even just clarify them, is think about cross-disciplinarity in three different ways. One is multidisciplinarity, so bringing faculty together who are bringing their disciplinary expertise to consider a common question or goal or problem. Interdisciplinarity, where one's own methodology may be drawing on multiple disciplines, as is the case in my own research, or transdisciplinary, which is developing new methodologies as you work together, right? So that emerge from the work itself. So we have found, and Susan might be able to elaborate on this as well, that there's some translation involved in this work when you try to do cross-disciplinary work that is magnifying and demonstrating interdependencies at all levels, not just cultural, political, but disciplinary interdependencies. So I really like that. You just triggered, Nicoletta, when you said dissent as productive. I started to think as productive and also as production.
I think it's a nice way of combining the method, the principle, and the object study. Absolutely. I'm sure that we will be talking more about interdisciplinarity, so I don't want to invade the field, but certainly it's one of the most productive, to borrow one of your terms, ways of showing the relevance of the humanities, in addition to creating change that is, again, constructive and helping different approaches to the humanities flourish. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I can jump in, I'm very much struck by the plurality of ways that we can discuss the very first question, which is connected to, though different from, the very different institutional placements we have. Private institutions, public institutions, and geographically different sorts of places. I was very struck by Allison's calling attention to the fact that a number of you are inaugural directors or in executive positions, which suggests that this is a moment when institutions are thinking or rethinking or open to repositioning the humanities in terms of the sphere of education. So I'd like to invite you to think about how the humanities are contributing to maybe a transformation from or a dissent from certain kinds of governing discourses about education, whether that's at your institution or elsewhere.
Well,
Please go right ahead, Sylvester.
yeah, one of the ways I think it's important to consider this moment in humanities writ large, and is certainly our case at Virginia Tech with our particular center and mission, is considering what we mean when we say humanities. There's a lot of dissent and disagreement over what counts as humanities. And one of the things that we were deliberate about in shaping our center was to have a big tent, that we're established within the College of Liberal Arts, Human Sciences. We were very deliberate in saying that when we say humanities, we mean humanistic, human-centered. That certainly includes all of those different entities within that College of Liberal Arts, Human Sciences. So that's performing arts, that's social science, that's people who study political theory, that is the disciplines that in some traditions are more narrowly interpreted as humanities. So you think of philosophy, for example, or the study of literature. And then beyond that college. So there are people who don't do any of those disciplines. We would still see them as humanists, as humanistic. Now, why is that important? If we're thinking about the history of dissent, it's important to consider that our colleges and universities have, not just within the US, but globally, have been transformed by the creation of new disciplines and departments in the 1960s and 70s that were typically movements such as Black studies, of Indigenous studies, of critical ethnic studies, of gender and sexuality studies, or women and gender studies, of Chicana studies. And those movements were deliberately, self-consciously dissenting against a normative understanding of what counted as scholarship, of what courses should be taught, of what curricula should look like. And they were typically formed, particularly in their earliest iterations, through people who were taking over buildings, who were subject to confrontations with the police, who were pitted against their administrations because they were trying to transform the curriculum and they could not get support from within the university. And so one of the things that's happened is that there is a hegemonic way of thinking about humanities that actually doesn't count those disciplines as humanities. It's a more narrow reading. Well, we have philosophy, we have history, we have the study of religion, but those other things aren't the core humanities, right? And then there's also a tradition, this is just one tradition, but it's a hegemonic one. And then there's a tradition of thinking that, well, humanities we don't solve problems. We critique, we study, but we're not problem-based scholarship. And that itself is the product of a history of power and privilege that has been shaped by populations that might not think they have overwhelming problems that should shape their scholarship. And so that's precisely why those disciplines of women and gender studies, of sexuality studies, of Chicano and Black studies emerged, because they were very focused on political repression, on histories of genocide, on structural systems of racism and sexism and anti-trans discrimination. And they are still in a situation where often they don't have departmental autonomy, whereas these traditional disciplines do. And so there is a history of dissent that has actually been part of the language and discourse and the practice and institutionalization of what counts as humanities. And so I think that it's something to be thoughtful about, even as we parse in our own institution today what we mean and whom we include or exclude when we talk about humanities. My own sense is that it becomes even more urgent for our humanities centers to take up the call of what the other panelists were talking about, of transdisciplinarity, because that transdisciplinarity was actually inherent to those dissenting disciplinary formations that emerged in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then it's also important to think about these larger questions of social justice. What role should scholarship play? So we have language of activist scholarship. And that category itself is a product of the history that we're talking about, where there's real scholarship and there's scholarship plus this other stuff. And what it embeds is a question of what actually counts as scholarship. So those are histories that are with us still that I think it's important for us to be mindful of when we're trying to understand the important questions you're asking about. What are the hegemonic formations that exist that become the terrain on which our humanities agenda and program and institutions have to contend whenever we are administering whatever our mission is?
I really appreciate that, Sylvester. And I'm sort of thinking how the arts have been the sort of distant cousin of those issues for decades in at the institutional level of perhaps always having a kind of dissent in order just to exist. So if areas like Chicano studies have had trouble being brought into the fold, you can imagine what dance studies or dance making or art making or performance or band, how that has had to we have had to find our way. So at Ohio State, with this global arts and humanities discovery theme, having the arts and humanities together continues to amaze me how it is stirring up all these fringe areas to begin to understand how to talk to each other, how to collaborate. And it is helping to resist the myopia that can happen in any given discipline, the kind of self-referential, holding tight onto your own center. So having the arts and humanities has helped this, what I call shift center, happen institutionally. We have a group of graduate students in our program, part of the graduate fellows, that meet throughout the year to do collaborative cross-disciplinary work, and they're coming out of all the fields you mentioned and the arts, and understanding how to actually enact new knowledge together. It's been very exciting. We also have arts creation grants that are specifically for cross-disciplinary projects, such as having a composer from the School of Music working with someone from astronomy. I know that's not humanities, but they are doing this together. And someone from dance working with the College of Nursing, for example, working on public health through performance. Middle East Studies Center working with a development of a theater, a play. So it's, I think we are at a new era of, as Nicoletta was talking about, no one size fits all, but getting people together in these projects and these graduate fellows, for example, has opened up some of these boundaries that have been held by those hegemonies that you speak of.
Yeah, and if I can just briefly elaborate on what Susan's saying about some of our initiatives, and also replying to Sylvester's thought about the humanities and what, the big tent humanities. We also have that view, as you could tell from Susan's examples, that we're focused on a wide range of humanistic orientations and artistic approaches, which includes scholars working in astronomy, researchers in the College of Medicine who then work with faculty in linguistics, et cetera. So we are hoping to continue to cultivate that kind of conversation. But something else that's going on as I would say, a kind of site of dissent is interrogating all of the constructs associated with the traditions to which you refer, Sylvester, of the humanities and humanistic ways of knowing. So, for example, and this is just something I'm pulling from my own research to exemplify this, but if we think about the history of liberal humanism, it is very much defined by the seeing is believing paradigm, right? This kind of ocular centricity. And along with that comes certain epistemologies or ways of knowing, that are very much about reflection. Right, the kind of mimetic or mirror metaphors of ways of knowing or of representation. So we are also finding a lot of our scholars who are doing cross-disciplinary work are interrogating those tropes and those ways of knowing to look at how differences, for example, materialize, less interested in sameness or reflection, and again, dissent as or difference as productive. So we're also seeing a lot of our faculty show interest in post-humanism. And, you know, we have a place for that within our initiative as well, which basically is looking at the relation, right, between human and non-human life, and thinking, you know, about all of the complex questions there, including, you know, the appropriation of indigenous knowledges also. So there, it's not to say that within the post-human is, you know, situated in our project as a panacea. In fact, no, it can be very troubling in some of the moves that it itself makes. But I'm just giving these few examples to say that we're finding that we're also having to interrogate the traditions of humanism at this moment as well.
Great. I guess it's my turn. Thank you for all these interesting points. I wish to go back to hegemonic thinking and interdisciplinarity to pick up where you left off. And, you know, I'm thinking of this idea of oppositional thinking that also somehow directed us while thinking about this event. You know, oppositional thinking about dominant paradigms, mainly the hegemony of STEM. I think it's better to approach this issue using the term complementarity. You know? So essentially an interdisciplinarity in which humanities material and humanities resources are not diluted, are not on the defensive, but are rather pivotal. And you know, Sylvester has spoken about this many times, the idea of not to pit the humanities against the sciences, but rather show that the two disciplinary areas go hand in hand in understanding the world around us. During the course of their lives, our students, we know, will have to retool themselves many times, going through multiple careers that really require a wide range of skills, because the world is complex. It poses unprecedented challenges. It's true that our tradition seems to be unable to solve problems, and obviously using cliches, but in fact, we're also saying that critical thinking, imagination, creativity are crucial tools precisely to solve problems, to create a very intellectually nimble new generation of people who are able to deal with a variety of circumstances. So already we see that the barriers between the humanities and technology are falling. Historians now use big data techniques to ask human-centered questions. Engineers use the same methods, but they put an emphasis on human interfaces. New technologies, I would say, depend on the humanities to survive because they appeal to people by having tech designers understand humans. And in order to understand humans, you need a deep knowledge of the humanities. And so also at Georgetown, we have many synergies of this sort at work through several interdisciplinary humanities programs and sponsored projects. I give a few examples. A medical humanities program, soon to become a minor. It brings together the fields of medicine and humanities, so literature, history, philosophy, ethics, and also the arts, film, theater, dance, visual arts, and social sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology. And the idea is to offer a program of study that situates medicine in its social, cultural, and historical context, emphasizing the tools of the humanities, which traditionally are left out of STEM disciplines. The medical school is also physically very close to the main campus, and so it also lends itself to these kinds of synergies. But beyond location, the concept wants to expand the undergraduate curriculum at Georgetown and break down disciplinary boundaries. And so in the same classroom, you have students, undergraduate and graduate, from both the college and the medical school. Beyond the educational mission, there is also the mission of future physicians or future intellectuals in line with the cura personalis, so that they care for the whole person. Healthy practitioners cannot treat the whole patient without recognizing and valuing the humanity, belief systems, cultural differences. Similarly, we have an environmental initiative housed in biology, which collaborates with the Humanities Initiative, and also a technology, ethics, and public policy program still in the making, but part of Georgetown's Tech and Society Initiative. And so once again, faculty members from computer science and from the humanities working together to create new pathways in technology, ethics, policy, and society drawing from current offerings, but also developing new ones. Briefly, another maybe intriguing way of bringing together disciplines that are not only humanities and not only STEM, Buddhist and Silk Road studies. So bringing together two notions that are by definition trans-regional, and bringing together East and West. So Silk Road, which emphasizes networks and processes of technological and cultural transmission. Buddhism also, one of the central products that were traded along the Silk Road. And in this way, these two multidisciplinary fields bear on one another and bring together not only anthropology, art history, philosophy, but also international trade, macroeconomics, environmental history, material cultural studies, and demography. So these are maybe some samples, very recent ones, that can show what we're trying to do in terms of interdisciplinarity.
See lots of heads nodding. We're almost at the moment when we should be taking questions from the floor. I very much don't want to be forcing the conversation in one direction rather than another, especially if continuing in this vein is productive. So we can always reserve to any questions or any remarks we want to make about, say, you know, the public value of the humanities for folding into the question and answer period, if we'd like. Anybody like to add to the conversation so far? Okay, let me then go to, we have one question from the floor, and it's from a member of the working group, Maria DeCake, who thanks us, thanks you rather. I have almost nothing to say about any of this. I had a specific question for Sylvester, but perhaps the other panelists might have something to say about this as well. Since Sylvester, you spoke about working with the science disciplines at Virginia Tech, Maria was wondering how faculty in those disciplines view your work, your outreach to them. Do they see it as productive, to use Nicoletta's remark about emphasizing the productive role of the humanities? What kinds of work do you do with these disciplines, and how has it been received? I think this is an incredibly interesting question. I've been representing cultural studies in the humanities more specifically in George Mason's new agenda, the Interdisciplinary Institute for Digital Innovation, as someone who is there to represent what the humanities have to offer. And I think there's tremendous curiosity, but the terms at which we come to the table have been so different. The scientists, who are brilliant people, lead with their contracts and their deliverables, and we lead with concepts. So I'm very interested in hearing how you talk about these things with people who have different languages, at least walking in.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maria. This is a great question. The short answer is it's been very productive, very positively received. A lot of that has to do with the transdisciplinary nature of Virginia Tech. So there are things such as the Institute for Creativity, Arts, and Technology that bring together faculty who are music artists, who are also doing human-computer interaction work, for example. And we have these, we call them destination areas, but they're large transdisciplinary communities of research that allow faculty to work across the university together. Our Center for Humanities has on its stakeholders committee and on its advisory board faculty from colleges across our university. In fact, our advisory board has representation from every college at the university, the medical college, from our business college, our College of Engineering, etc. That was intentional because we wanted to build relationships with faculty across the university. We wanted to focus on that humanistic, human-centered import of what we're doing. And that's been very well received. We have, at Virginia Tech, we're best known for our leadership in technology, but we are a comprehensive university. Some of this, I think, is because Virginia Tech deliberately became comprehensive in 1969. And that's had an impact on the, if I can call it, the DNA of the institution. So maybe this is a little bit more fertile soil for these types of collaborations. But it has been very positively received. And we're also part of the Public Interest Technology University Network that the Ford Foundation is sponsoring, that started 3 years ago. That is focusing on creating more civic-minded technology work, particularly in preparing the future of talent. And so we're reshaping what we mean when we say that people are technologists. That's not just technical. We need people who understand inequality. We need people who understand what that means for the future of work, who are interested in designing and redesigning how we deliver learning, for example, or who are thinking about child development within the context of digital technology. We need all of those things. And so those are ways that faculty are able to collaborate in teaching, in research, in having conversations about advancing a larger agenda to have a society that is certainly overwhelmingly shaped by technology, and understanding that that's a comprehensive set of challenges that requires many different disciplines and not just technical ones. So that's been embraced, it's been positively received, and it is actually generating some very fruitful work.
I would like to jump in here for a moment and just suggest that the very presence of a humanities center at an institution highlights the possibility for collaboration with humanists. I mean, it sounds kind of simple, but even in our very short existence of just several months, we have been approached by our colleagues in engineering to participate in a proposal for an artificial intelligence project. And so I think that like occupying institutional space as a center has made the possibility of these kinds of collaborations not just more desirable, but more possible, because there's a site for this kind of work and this kind of humanities thinking. It's not dispersed throughout the college, in other words.
There's another question from the floor. Collapsing differences between both disciplines, as well as East-West epistemology, has been discussed. This person is wondering whether you think these two things are mutually compatible. The ways in which we pursue advancing disciplines currently are very much forwarded through a Western mode of knowledge production. What would incorporating other epistemologies look like? What does this look like in spaces outside of the humanities? And thank you for that question.
I'll just jump in briefly, because I think the arts certainly are, in many of the arts, in the making and developing of artistic practices, are owning more and more that there's permission around things such as sacredness, magic, imagination, memory, aspects that have not typically been embraced in humanities academy kind of language. Even within the arts, we have struggled with thinking that something like imagination, as a colleague of mine once recently said that was sort of in the land of relegated to children and children's play. But it's changing. There is more effort to broaden the perspective of what the very makeup of our work is.
I don't see another question at the moment. So if I can return us to something that I've been thinking about, and that is, listening to all the rich and contextualization of humanities work, I wonder how you would, to a public audience, define the humanities, given the elasticity of the concept and the challenges that have been made, that have been offered to the very sort of foundational narratives of the human, the man-centric white European origins of the discipline of humanism and its sort of cognate discipline, the humanities. So if we don't buy that narrative, or if we want to challenge it, what would we then say the humanities are, talking to a public audience? Uh-oh.
So I would quickly say it certainly depends on the audience. When people ask me that question, I'm always mindful of whom I'm speaking to, because and we should have ready definitions of humanities, while also recognizing that any definition, if people want two sentences, is going to be problematic and exclude all kinds of things. But I emphasize, without sounding tautological, humanistic or human-centered, focusing on issues of such as an example, social justice. So what kind of world do we want to live in? And what kind of things do we need to do to ensure that that's the kind of world we end up with? And so people start to think of things like democratic outcomes, of understanding historical patterns. And so I'm not trying to reify history as a discipline, but just, you know, understanding that we have gotten to where we are. Right? And so we should understand those things, and then having a sense of accountability to what this means for a world of people without being anthropocentric. So Wendy, you were talking about the importance of the post-human. One challenge that I received from a colleague at our university was that this emphasis on human-centered approaches to X, Y, and Z, he saw as being dangerous for the environment, because it seemed to focus on privileging humans over everything else. And we have lots of humanists who are environmentalists, of course, who are critiquing the anthropocentrism, but they still think they're humanists. So we need to have some room for nuance. But those are examples of how I've tried to explain to people what we mean when we talk about humanities.
Yeah, and I would just pick up, if I may, as well, to say that I think one of my major orientations, thinking about the discovery theme and the construct of discovery, where I started, is that an investment in the arts and humanities is an investment in social change. That is a given. Now, yes, I believe we do have to persuade people of that often, but for me, that's foundational, right? So there are two examples I just wanted to briefly share of how we're trying to foreground social change and faculty and students and staff as social agents. And we're doing it, I think, through the way in which we're organizing cross-disciplinary initiatives or invitations. So a new initiative we have is called the Society of Fellows, very traditional term. You probably recognize it from Cornell and Princeton. Everybody, the Ivies have these Society of Fellows. Well, we're trying to look at the Society of Fellows as a cohort of faculty, graduate students, and undergrads who get together every year to explore a theme from humanistic and artistic approaches. And this year, our theme is human rights, pasts, and futures. So right there, you could see, right, we're already bringing in a concept, human rights, which traditionally is associated with political science or legal, juridical realm. And we're saying, no, it's not only that, right? So there's a kind of almost dissenting intervention in just the opportunities and the way in which we're framing the opportunities. And one other example is we have a new K through 12 teaching institute that was designed by an associate professor of history, Hassan Jeffries, called Difficult Subjects. And the topic for this year, he's directing the institute for us, is American slavery. He's bringing together K through 12 teachers in the same space from all different disciplines, the arts, music, history, language, and literature, and saying, what does it mean to discuss civil rights, American slavery, racism across the disciplines and vertically from kindergarten through high school, right? So we're not just getting the American government or American history and American slavery unit, right, in the junior year. So these are two interventions, right, where I see us disrupting in a productive way.
I just jump in with something maybe more abstract, but that seems to be able to tie together all the different definitions we have tried to give. The humanities are really stories we tell about ourselves, about the world we live in. So it's not just about human beings, but also the surroundings. Stories that we try to understand who we are and where we are. And I think that it's precisely also when we deal with interdisciplinarity, it's precisely this idea of the humanities being able to provide a kind of toolkit that is able to bring together the toolkits of the different disciplines and allow them to speak to one another and to work together. We have a sort of holistic narrative that is able to account for timeless issues that pertain to the totality of knowledge that we're trying to convey and with which we come to terms also in view of change. So I think it's the narrative is something that we have that can be of help also in any dialogue that we try to establish within the humanities, but also with other areas of the curriculum of our research.
I was struck by your answer, Nicoletta, because one of the things it does is remind us of the importance of questions of form to some of the things that we're talking about. And that, of course, connects up with the way in which the arts and the humanities are connected in sort of profound ways. You know, we read the texts that arts produce. We engage with the forms that they make available to us. And that's very specific to humanities disciplines, no matter how broadly you construe the term. This may be a related question, it may not be, but it's from the floor. It's from Christina Olson, who thanks everyone again for this provocative discussion, which I second, of course. Her question, it starts with Nicoletta, and it's about your comment about negotiating conversations with the different stakeholders, perhaps because you primarily identified students and donors. She asks about what has been your experience, certainly Nicoletta, but everyone else, having challenging conversations about the value of the humanities across the campus. Have any of you felt that you've achieved success in converting those who are skeptical about the value of the humanities into stakeholders? And Nicoletta, I'll invite you to start, and then everyone else can chime in.
Briefly, based upon my experience, obviously, inevitably it's limited, I have found a much better terrain than I expected when I took over this responsibility. It's true that we have to use a certain language, but it's a story that is understood. I think the moment is great to emphasize why we need the humanities. You know, take a look at the pandemic, take a look at all the tragic episodes that have lacerated certainties also here. We realize that we need to rediscover once again a common language that can bring us together, that can help us understand broad connections across all the different issues that we have to cope with. And so both with donors, with parents, the idea of the humanities as a crucial component of any educational experience or preparation for life in the world, in the real world, it speaks to people because they understand that just vocational preparation and education is not enough. We need to be able to understand each other, and this is where the humanities are valued. So I want to end with an optimistic note. I think it has been easier than I thought. But as also Sylvester was saying, we have to use different languages according to the context.
Any of the rest of you encountered challenges or unexpected opportunities in discussing the value of your enterprises with stakeholders who don't naturally live in these questions?
I'll just say the obvious, that everyone is working on clarifying language. I think, Nicoletta, you talked earlier about the need for languages across disciplines are entirely different. We're developing some ways to do that with our collaborative projects, and working with a little card game that we've developed that gets beyond the ologies and the isms and the obvious levels of I write, you count, I choreograph, you analyze, but that we are getting down to the deeper processes behind the work that we all make, so that there, in doing those conversations, there's a tremendous excitement about the value, the way that people work and think and produce.
Lovely to hear. Well, I see our time seems to be about up. Allison, what should we do?
Well, we could ask again if there are any questions from our attendees. I just wanted to, I wanted to add one of the things that you all have made me think about as you've been speaking and thinking about productive dissent, right? And making connections across kind of what had been historically chasms of difference. It almost sounds to me, I mean, I'm thinking of Chantal Mouffe and agonistic democracy and the way in which sort of like these links are forged, you know, across difference in sort of to form interesting new coalitions, right? That are not premised on sameness, but that are acknowledging difference. And this might be a kind of constructive way to think about the work that we do as we engage other disciplines across the campus, and the work that we think, you know, that we take to be so important. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I think people took us at our word.
Well, I want to thank you so much, panelists, for this really inspiring and thoughtful discussion. We are at the very beginning of our Humanities Center here, and it's very helpful to all of us, I think, in our sort of extended community here to think through some of these issues about what role the center might play on campus, in our local community, and sort of more broadly as a site of humanities and humanities related work, you know, with all of the sort of implications that you have raised for us today. So I thank you all very much, and I thank you to our audience for attending, and of course I thank you to my colleague Denise for moderating this event in such a successful manner.
Well, one last remark. I thank our panelists for taking what were fairly, you know, didactic and dry questions and running with them in directions I hadn't begun to anticipate, which is, of course, what I hope, and also, if I may say so, an enactment of what we hope most from the humanities. Take something, turn it around, make it richer, make it more profound. That's what
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Honor.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation again. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to being in contact with you again.